And hello, everybody on the internet. My name is Ellingly, and I'm the executive director of Unpossible NL, and this year coordinators of the RPM Challenge internationally. Welcome to this. I'm very excited today to be doing these kinds of workshops in collaboration with organizations, especially in Newfoundland, where I am based, and you. Today we're uh, there's a workshop co-presented by the NL Folk Art Society with recording and mixing tips, something that you're probably interested in.
We hope so.
Yeah, we hope so. And joining me now is Brian Kenny, is a theater designer and audio engineer and all-around great guy. And I mean, just look at him. He's well lit. He's got
You can't say I'm a theater designer and I just sit in my bedroom like
he's
that.
trustworthy. You just get that vibe from him, right? And this is the kind of workshop that we're presenting here now. How you doing, Brian?
I'm good, Elling. It's good to see you virtually.
I'm just embarrassing you.
No, it's all good.
Nice guy. um
Got to live up to the expectation,
yeah, I mean, I know you through theater, but this year in particular, I think I've heard your name so much because you've been doing a lot of live streaming.
That's right. Yeah, I mean the theater kind of tool set that I have, the skill set that I have from theater, really ended up translating well into live streaming. I haven't actually live streamed many events before the pandemic started, but having done video and projection design, lighting and sound design, like all of those are the things that need to come together for a good broadcast, right? You need to see people, you need to hear people. So yeah, just kind of that was my pivot, and when that was the hottest word of 2020. So yeah, that's kind of where I put all my energy to kind of block out some of the noise of what was happening in the world around me, and it's been really rewarding. I've learned a lot about cameras, about computers, about the internet. And yeah,
The
I've been
tubes.
really mostly
It's all the
just really,
tubing.
that's right. But really, I've just been kind of mostly grateful for the opportunity to continue to help people and continue to support, especially theater projects, which is where most of my streaming stuff started out early in the pandemic, and then kind of got into some music and then some more dance and other things. So yeah, it's kind of run the gambit now, but obviously theater was my first love and still is, but really grateful to work on lots of different projects, as you know.
um but we're not here to talk about live streaming or
No,
about
we're not. We're not.
theater. We're here to talk about sound.
About the sound, yeah.
So how did you tell me about your work with sound? Like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, similar to live streaming. Good segue. It was the same thing. Is that it came out of a necessity for my sound design work. So, a sound designer, for those of you who don't know, in the theater, the role is the most obvious when you go to see a musical. A sound designer kind of designs the whole system of all the actors wearing microphones, amplifying the band, and then, depending on the show, if there's any environmental sounds like thunder, lightning, crickets, rain, that kind of stuff, that needs to be built in the theater in kind of a surround sound environment, that all falls on the sound designer as well. So through
So
that
you're
process,
recreating reality.
recreating out reality a lot, yeah, and it's really interesting to work in such a construct like a theater with its proscenium and its curtains and all of its kind of
Right.
sleight of hand. It's really funny to always be working in that environment and to try to go after realism. It's kind of an interesting thing, but in terms of like multi-track recording and mixing, it all came out of a necessity of working on shows like that. A lot of the bigger musicals, where they run for a long time, especially some of the larger commercial shows, they'll run for months on ends, and some shows indefinitely. The way that producers will try to cut down on costs a little bit is that they'll multi-track one musician who's in the pit. So there'll be like a guitar player, and they can only play one guitar at a time. So instead of hiring a second guitar player, sadly, what they tend to do is kind of get that guitar player to overdub themselves while we're in the tech process,
Mhm.
and then the whole orchestra will play to a click track so that those stems or tracks can be played back along. And it just every now and then it'll happen in a larger show just to kind of thicken up the sound and make it sound like there's 10 or 15 members down in the pit, when in reality there's actually only 6 people down there. So that was really where all of a sudden I needed to be quite proficient in multi-track recording, mixing those multi-tracks down, mastering them, and EQing them so that they work in the space and sound just like the band does, so that it's a seamless experience for the audience. It's not like, oh, and then the tracks played. So that's kind of a part of it. And then the other thing too is when on the smaller scale shows, I do a lot of composition in my sound design. So I'll use like basic synth pads to heighten tension. I'll record small melodies on my guitar or on piano or whatever, just to act as underscoring for a monologue, like a lot more subtle stuff when it comes to a straight play. And that is another instance then where I'll whip out the kind of recording software and overdub myself, do a quick mix and master, and then load it into the theater computer to play it back every night during the show. So that was kind of my in. And then again, as you mentioned, with the pandemic and stuff, the kind of big all of a sudden kind of learning curve that I had to have was I did the music at Harborside Park in downtown St. John's, and the way we decided to do that, because it's in an outdoor location that doesn't have reliable internet, is that we went down there and we recorded them in the morning, and then I quickly turned them around and we put them up on the city's YouTube page. And some of them were straightforward, 2 singers, a guitar, something like that. But then towards the end, we started to do full bands. So I was coming home with 17, 18, 19 tracks to mix down and then line it up with the video.
Holy cow.
And send it out. So that was kind of where all of a sudden it was like, yeah, I'm a recording engineer now. Yeah. At least I have to be.
And you're used to working on a deadline.
Exactly. But it was a good experience, because it was a lot of the things I'm going to talk through here now in a moment is exactly that like you can get lost down the rabbit hole of all the possibilities of the power of the software, and working on a deadline like that, or even like the RPM challenge itself, means that you have to just kind of make quick decisions. And hopefully we can share some tips and tricks today to get people right in there.
Totally. Well, I'll let you do your thing, and I'll interject. I'll moderate I'll make sure there are no trolls out there in the comments. But yeah, don't. But I'll be monitoring the comments, and if you have any questions, just pop them in there, and I'll bring them to Brian whenever there's a good moment. Take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Ellen. So I thought where I would start is just talking through a little bit of the process from top to bottom. So you've got your songs written out, you want to record them, you've got some arrangements maybe in mind, or maybe you're going to work through that during the recording process. But there's a pretty straightforward checklist of things that you need to do, kind of process A, B, C, D, E. With the setup here today to make this live stream enabled, I'm going to be able to share my screen, but it's going to be a little awkward for me to actually get the music straight to you. So apologies in advance if we fumble with that just a little bit. Elling's going to be on guard, and he'll stop me if all of a sudden you guys aren't hearing me or something. But I think we're all set. We did a little test beforehand. But let's kind of go over the overview here. So we'll go over tracking. And tracking is when you've got your song, you're ready to lay down the recording, and you want to do, maybe you're doing a bunch of your friends are going to get together and record. This year, maybe that's not going to be as possible, depending on where you are. So maybe you're going to do a couple of other things, like overdub yourself, where you just play one instrument all the way through, then you put that instrument into your headphones and play over it and play over it and play over it. Or maybe you're going to do a little bit of an online collaboration. Maybe you're going to record the drums, you're going to send it off to your friend, they're going to play the bass, they're going to send it off to someone who's going to sing on it, that kind of stuff. And I'm going to try to cover very broadly, as I said, there's a lot of rabbit holes we can go down here today, but very broadly things that you're going to want to keep in mind while you're doing that. So the first thing I thought I would talk about is a click track. It's a term that I'm sure everyone has heard and maybe doesn't know what it is. So a click track is simply just a more recording, a specific term for a metronome. So what you want to do is before you even think about starting the track, you want to maybe take out a metronome. There's free apps for your phone. You can pick one up at a music store. A lot of audio workstations will have one built in, so you could just throw up an empty session and set your tempo to a guess at first and then jam along, because what it is actually a really important decision to get right at the beginning of your process, because this is now the speed that everything's going to be locked to. There are some advanced techniques that if you say started recording at 100 beats per minute and then after working on it for 3 days you're like, oh, it's a bit slow, maybe we should bump it up. Some of the more advanced features in some recording software will actually allow you to stretch the audio to do that, or in that case, it actually would be condensing the audio. But it's not ideal, and you will lose some artifacts and start to get a little bit of wonkiness. So I encourage you, first of all, to sit down with a metronome, jam out your tune, and pick a tempo. Pick a key that should be a little bit more straightforward, and then set your session up. So before we listen to anything, I'm just going to bring up my screen here. You'll see that I'm using Logic Pro. Logic is based is an Apple product. Apple actually makes the software themselves, so it's only for Mac. But all the things that I'm showing you here today should be findable on whatever DAW you use, DAW or DAW. You'll hear me say that a bunch today. That stands for Digital Audio Workstation, and it really just means any recording software. So Pro Tools, you have Audacity is a free one. You have GarageBand is the free version of Logic. There's lots of different things out there that you can get your hands into. But any of the terms that I use, even some of the drop-down menus, they might be in a slightly different place, but any DAW should have these features. So here in the session, you'll see up at the top, you can see your project settings here. It might be a little hard for you to see, but I've got a little project brought up here that I did at the beginning of quarantine. I was recording over myself. This was nothing connected to RPM. This is not an original song. It's a traditional Newfoundland song called The Northern Lights of Labrador. So I was just kind of wanting to get back into making some music. So this was a little fun project I did right as the quarantine kind of hit us back in March, all that time ago. So I did exactly what I just described. I kind of played over the click track. I decided that 157 beats per minute, a little bit of a random tempo, but that's where I kind of felt comfortable. It's a waltz, so it's in 3/4, and it's in D major. So the good thing, the reason that you want to pay attention to this before you even start is because every audio workstation is going to be the same in that as you get into editing and overdubbing, all of these bar lines will actually mean something if your session is set up the right way. It means that if you have to punch in a mistake, or if you do multiple takes over an instrument and you want to use, oh, I got more notes right in this section of the piece, and then I kind of made a little mistake, and then on the next take I got that part right. If you want to start mixing and matching those things to get a perfect track, all of this is going to be really important to you, because you're depending on which audio workstation you're using, the tracks will want to snap to grid, or you can also nudge them, but your workflow speeds up a lot if everything is actually true. That if this that I'm pointing out with my cursor now actually is the downbeat of measure 33. So that's kind of the setup session click track. The next thing you want to think about is your physical setup for your instrument. So if you've got an instrument that doesn't have any sort of plug-in, or if you're not just using synthesizers, if you're using anything live, then you'll need a mic like the one that I'm talking into right now. You'll need an interface, which is basically a umbrella term for any piece of equipment that allows you to get audio into your computer. Some of them are simple as a little USB dongle that has an XLR connector on the end of it. Some of them are a little bit bigger, they're more box size or rack mount size. And then the other way to go about it too is that there's little handheld Zoom recorders, for example, that you could actually record outside of the computer and then bring those tracks in. It's a little more involved, but it is a relatively inexpensive way to get audio just coming into your computer. The other way, of course, is that there's a built-in microphone in your computer. It's not going to be the best quality, but if you just need something to get started or to scratch some ideas out, don't forget that that's there. The second thing you'll need is a set of headphones, especially if you're overdubbing yourself, or if you're overdubbing anything. In order for you to get clean signal into the program, you don't want any of the song playing in the room that you're recording. So even like on Zoom calls where I'm wearing these headphones now so that Elling and I don't get any echoey loopbacks, this is super important that I can have the click just come into these headphones, and then you don't actually hear any of the click track on the recorded instruments, which is also key. So you got your microphone, you've got your interface, you've got your headphones, you've jammed around in your session, and you've decided on a tempo. So now you're going to hit record, right? So think through a little bit how you want to structure it. And this is where I'm going to switch over and just kind of show you what I did on this particular track. Is that this is a traditional song that I knew how to play on mandolin. Like you might play it at a jam session or an Irish session at a pub. So I knew that I wanted to record the melody first. I just wanted to play the tune on the mandolin. And then after that, I knew that I would go back and add guitar strumming chords, that I would play a bit of bower on, maybe add some other elements as well. But I wanted to get the melody through first. So I took that click track, I recorded the melody on top of it, and then I was able to start adding my other instruments. So let's just have a quick listen here. I'm going to turn off my microphone and turn on the audio program here, and we could just have a little listen. And I'll build it up in kind of a way so that you can hear each thing in isolation. All right, there you go. So you kind of heard first this a little bit of a click track, then the mandolin with that, and then guitar, drum, and then there was a little bit of harmony there on an octave mandolin or bouzouki. So that kind of gives you an idea of how that structure might go and what that might sound like. Once you have all of your takes done, and something that's really interesting about a lot of the modern programs now is that you'll see this yellow bar here at the top. This is a loop section. So I've just highlighted the B section of the song all the way through the end, the final chord. And what that allows me is that, you know, I'm a sound designer and engineer first, not a musician. So I make lots of mistakes. There's nothing wrong with that. What this actually allowed me to do is hit record. And as long as I had kind of a bit of a visual reference in front of me of where I was at in the song in terms of, you know, the A, B, B, A structure of a traditional Newfoundland song, I was able to just keep playing, and I would let it go around again and around again and around again. And the first, like I was referring to earlier with the grid lines, the first couple of times I played, I flubbed a note here, flubbed a note there. But you just keep going, and you try to go until, at least in your little mental archive, you think, okay, at some point during these 5 or 6 or 8 or 20 takes, I think I've played every note on pitch and on time. So now I can stop and I'll go back and start editing. This is where, again, you know, being at the same tempo, being locked to a click track is going to help you because you can slide things around. But in a lot of these, I shouldn't have covered up my work. I kind of covered it up so you couldn't see how many takes I did, but I should have left it to show you. But, you know, I was able to go and slice, you know, 4 bars at a time between, you know, take 1, take 5, take 3, take 2, and then it just prints all as one even strip. While you're doing this, all the way, by the way, you might be wondering about plugins, EQ, compression, reverb, all this kind of stuff. My advice to you while you're recording is to just focus on the technical music side of things and to leave all of that to the mixing process. If it's a song that's particularly vibey and you're a performer who likes to track with reverb or likes to track with a bit of echo or something like that, or if you're a drummer who prefers to not hear your drums too dry, you can do some other tips and tricks of like maybe just adding that effect onto your headphone mix so that you're not committing to any sounds far in advance. I totally get the desire to kind of put yourself in an environment. It can really help bring out a solid performance, but you don't want to commit to anything too early in a recording process if you don't have to. The drier and the cleaner and the more isolated your tracks are, the more flexibility you're going to have in your mixing process, in your mastering process. So that's just a little tip and trick there. Like, you don't necessarily want to have your signal flow be that your microphone goes through a piece of equipment, you're adding reverb there, and then the reverb affected microphone is what's getting recorded, because you can't go back and take the reverb off of a microphone. So just a little thing to keep in mind. But now let's dig in. Let's say that we've got all this here. We've got it edited. It sounds right musically from top to bottom. The right notes are falling in the right place, and we want to start making some artistic decisions. So I'm going to open up our mixer here. Before we get into actually using the tools, I'm just going to talk through a little bit about how I set my mixer up. And this is something, like I was referring earlier to Elling. This is something that I didn't necessarily do just earlier this year. This is something that I ended up doing for myself out of necessity to be able to make my workflow a little bit faster, a little bit more predictable. I didn't have to always stumble and look for presets and stuff like that. So what you're looking at now is a little bit of a hybrid between the template file that I've created in Logic, so that every time I open it, my reverb is in the same place, my preferred plugin chains are all ready to go. It's a little bit of a hybrid between that and the little recording session that I actually did when I was tracking this. So I've flattened everything so that we can kind of go through some of this together. But let's just look at what's actually here. So you'll see that, there's a couple different colors of tracks down here. My mandolin, my guitar, and my octave mandolin all had pickups built in. And pickups are great because it gives you a really dry signal of that instrument. But the downside of that is that it's a really dry signal of that instrument. It sounds a little bit thin, a little bit papery. It's not overly natural. You don't get any of the room or the resonance of the instrument. So for each of these instruments on this session, there's two tracks. There's the direct input from the pickup and a microphone just 6 inches in front of the instrument itself. I actually used the same microphone for all of the instruments. It was just one relatively inexpensive condenser mic. I actually ended up switching right at the end. I used a dynamic microphone on the drum right at the end, just because I like the sound a little bit more. But you'd be amazed, I think, what you can do with the same microphone. Everyone thinks like, oh, this microphone's great for guitar, this microphone's great for vocals, this microphone's great for drums. And that's certainly the case. There's a lot of purpose-built microphones. But if you're doing a home studio recording and you're not that well versed in what you're doing, if you're kind of in over your head a little bit, don't overthink the microphone. You can get a Shure SM57. It's 100% bulletproof, and it sounds pretty good on just about everything. For me, for any gearheads out there, this was the Rode NT1 I used on everything, apart from the drum, where I actually did use an SM57. So in your mixer, then, you want to line all those things up. So you have mandolin, microphone, mandolin, DI, guitar, microphone, guitar, DI, octave mandolin, microphone, octave mandolin, DI, and then the drum, SM57. And then the thing that I was talking about earlier in terms of me developing my kind of workflow is I really started to lean into mix buses. It's something that I did a little bit more out of necessity before, but now I don't start without it. A mix bus is basically a summing point. So all of your instruments have to eventually get to what's called an output bus, which is the main left right. That's what's going to come out of your speakers. However, in between the instrument itself and that output bus, you're going to want to make changes to it. You're going to want to EQ it. You're going to want to maybe add some effects. And the easiest way to keep track of all of this stuff and to really kind of take advantage of some of the mixing techniques that I'm going to show you is to bring everything to another point between point A and point B. So what I have here is I actually have a lead bus, a rhythm bus, and a percussion bus. In this song, this is a little bit overkill because there's one lead instrument, there's only two rhythm instruments, and there's only one drum. But by having this template here, if I were to change this from a folk song to a rock song, then the lead would be the vocalist. The rhythm would have multiple guitars, bass, maybe synthesizer, and of course the percussion would have likely a drum kit with 8, 9, 10, 11 microphones on it. And then potentially some other auxiliary percussion too. You could get some congas, some shakers, all kinds of stuff. So that it shows its benefits a little bit more in a busier session like that. But where we're just looking at skimming across the basics today, I thought I would include that step. So on this bus right now, I don't have a lot. I have a standard compressor there just to kind of deal with the dynamics, which we'll talk about in a second. This is also where I'm able to send that instrument or that bus, that group of instruments, into a reverb or an effect engine. And then those effects buses are over here as well. So again, it's different points. And what's really great about this, and the reason that I started using it when I had to edit really frantically, is that it leaves everything really exposed. On the one hand, your mixer gets a little more intimidating because what should probably be a session with 5 channels is now, you can see the mixer here goes across 10 or 12 faders. But what I really like about it, and I'm a pretty visual person myself, like, a lot of people, if you go down the YouTube rabbit holes of like mixing 101, people will tell you to mix with your ears and not your eyes. And in that analogy, they're referring to, meters or plugins that have fancy little dials on them and stuff like that. And it is a good trick. And you do eventually kind of want to maybe even just close your eyes and listen to what you're doing and make sure you're not just kind of like adding something for the sake of adding something. But by structuring your session this way, I find it's really easy to go back and troubleshoot things. Like if you're listening to the mix and something's bothering you, you now have all of these check-in points that you can go through and make sure that things are doing what you want them to do. And then finally, everything comes to this last master right here. And you'll see that this master does have quite a string of plugins, and that's for a very specific reason that hopefully we'll get to by the end of this. But here we are, 28 minutes in, so we got to keep on track. Elling, how we doing back there?
Great. Fabulous. I'm very big compared to your little image there, but lots of people watching, and hope if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I have one question from Guitar Hero 310. Sure. Due to sleeping babies in the house, I'm recording guitars primarily via DI. What are some good ways to add space to the guitar sound? You're probably going to get to this later, but he's just throwing on some plate reverb for now.
That's a great place to start. So what I was going to do next is go through kind of EQ, compression, and effects really quickly. Again, a bit of a rushed overview, but to show what each element does for those of you who might not know. And if for those of you who have a basic idea of exactly what we're just referring to, of like, okay, I understand a little bit compression, EQ, and reverb, but how can I get the most out of them? So considering we had a question about a guitar through a DI, why don't we use that as our example? So I'm just going to quickly solo up our guitar here. Put in an EQ. All right, so we're going to lose my microphone for a second. I'm going to make some changes to the EQ, make some changes to compression, and then maybe add a little bit of plate reverb. And then I'll kind of come back and turn my microphone on. We can discuss kind of what I did and why. So bear with me. Technical interlude here. So very, very rough and very quick. What we did there
Bravo.
is, oh, thank you, Ellen. Thank you. So again, where I had the microphone available, obviously you'll see the automation was actually kind of snapping that fader down after we looped back around. That's because I had the DI quite buried in the mix. I was using it to kind of bring out a little bit of sharpness in the guitar and really leaning on the microphone to do a lot of the heavy mixing for the song in the end. But just for the sake of this example, I turned it up so we can have a listen to what it's doing. So we'll start with EQ. So EQ, very basic. It is a series of bands that you can manipulate the tone of the sound. So, you know, everyone refers to things pretty broadly as having low end, bass, middle, and high or treble. And what I've done here is I've taken a lot of the low end out of that particular track because, again, the DI is very thin sounding already. So anything that is actually coming in through that DI on my pickup, and again, this is going to be specific from instrument to instrument, is a lot more of like impacty sounds. It's not actually nice, round, low, mid tone. It's things like your hand hitting the guitar or the thud coming through. And one of the things we're going to get to when we talk to right at the end about EQing and mastering your overall mix is that one of the best ways to give yourself an advantage heading into the mixing process is to EQ stuff out of each instrument that you just don't need. So if your voice, for example, doesn't have a whole lot of information under, if you can't see this on your screen, that this filter is about 100 hertz. If you don't have a whole lot of information coming out of that and you actually take it out completely, it makes more room in the mix is kind of the term that we use for other instruments that do need to live there. So your bass guitar, your kick drum, in this case, it will be the lower end of the boron. And it's a lot easier to get things, give each thing its own space when you've done some sculpting of the spectrum of the actual EQ. So when we're talking about the space of a mix, just to go down that rabbit hole quickly, there's kind of three or four tools that you can use. You can obviously use level. You can turn the guitar down and turn the mandolin up, and you'll hear the mandolin more than you hear the guitar. You can use EQ. You can make sure that the mandolin that's really thin and really bright kind of shines in that upper register. And then at the same time, you might want to dull the guitar in that upper register and make sure that it has a little bit of an accentuated lower middle register. And then the same thing with the drum. Maybe the drum has just a little bit of bite so that you can hear it, that it's percussive and not lumpy. And then you really want to fill out the low end. That'll help once you start using that tool, you'll notice that your faders aren't as far apart maybe as they are when you first start mixing. So that's level and EQ. The next thing is the three-dimensional space of a stereo mix. So the next two tools would be pan, placing an instrument slightly left or slightly right, And also with that becomes width. Something that Guitar Hero 310 mentioned is a plate reverb. And when I added the plate reverb right there at the end, if you're wearing headphones on our stream here, or if you have some sort of a stereo setup, you might have heard that there was a little bit of a spread there. And that's because the plate reverb actually is constructed in such a way that it is going to try to give you a wider stereo image, which is desirable for some instruments. Guitar is one of them. Drums that actually have things like when you're mixing a drum kit, you might want to put the hi-hat over on the left side of the track versus the floor tom over on the right side of the track, or vice versa, depending on if you're a right-handed drummer. But that when a user or a user when a listener puts on their headphones and closes their eyes and wants to really get into your mix, it's those little tricks then that when there's a big drum fill or something and the drums actually go from left to right in your headphones, that people go, wow, okay, this is really great, I'm really into this. So the two-dimensional aspect of that is pan, and then the kind of third dimension of perceived depth is done with effects and levels. So a little bit of reverb, for example, can make something sound like it's a little bit further away. And if you have another instrument or another channel that's completely dry, which just means no effects, then that sounds like it's right in front of your face. So then you can actually start to build a room. And going back to what Ellie and I were talking about at the beginning of the stream about in my work in theater of trying to recreate realism, this is kind of an element of musical mixing as well, that if everyone records in mono and the pan is straight up the middle, it's gonna sound like a tin kind of effect, a really simple, boring kind of mix. But as you start to, as an engineer, play around with the idea of like, okay, let's close my eyes for a second. Let's pretend, even if we did do all of this in isolation, let's pretend that we're in a room jamming together. And let's picture the drums at the back of the stage, that the bass player's over here, the keyboard player's over here. Maybe the lead guitar is right down the middle. Maybe if there's two guitars, they only slightly separate the center, but the lead singer definitely needs to be right in front. That's like a pretty typical setup. So in your drum mix, you might want to add some reverb that actually makes it sound like you're on a big stage. Same thing with the guitars. Maybe the bass wants to be a little drier so that it's easier to pick out in the mix. Maybe the vocals don't want to be in an echoey room, but maybe you want to add some dimension to it. So you can do delay, you can do flange effects, you can do phase effects or distortion, and it adds color to the vocal without taking away your ability to hear the lyrics. These are all kinds of things that you want to look at. To go back to our humble little traditional music song here for a second, where this all starts to come to a head is that each instrument is contributing these things to the overall mix, like we talked about earlier. So on your mix buses and on your main output, you're going to want to keep that in mind, that each instrument is adding to the pot, right? If you're making a soup and you're adding any sort of seasoning, any sort of flavor, maybe some cheese, because every good meal has cheese. You have to remember that, like, there's salt in your butter, there's salt in that cheese, there's salt in maybe the protein that you're throwing in. So at the very end, you want to taste it before maybe you add any more salt on top, kind of thing. Audio is kind of the same thing. If everything is contributing low end on the master mix, there's going to be way too much low end. So for example, here on the guitar, we start by taking it out. On the mandolin, I would start by taking it out, giving the drum some room to breathe. The next thing you kind of want to do then is think about, okay, spatialization, right? Where am I going to place each instrument kind of in the left to right? And then lastly, of course, once you have that picture kind of painted, you're going to want to go back and actually tailor things, turn things up a little bit, turn things down a little bit, maybe add effects, take effects away, until you're at a place where the overall song is appealing. On a simple song like this, that might mean that every instrument is the same volume from start to finish. As you get into a little bit more complicated music, be it jazz or rock or hip hop, you're going to find that there's going to be a lot of instances where you want to change those levels dynamically throughout the song. So I'm not going to go into it in too much detail now, but it's just to acknowledge that also automation and the drums being loud in the chorus and then maybe quiet in the verse, the guitar being in the background but then rising up as it has a solo. That is also all very important parts of making the song feel live almost. Maybe not big arena reverbs, but making sure that there is a way to to kind of give things life and give things motion. It's going to make your song more interesting too. If everything just comes in at the same volume and you've got verse, chorus, and you're out, it's going to sound a little more basic, I guess. I'm seeing some of the comments come in here. I think the cheese would definitely in this case be the mandolin. Mandolin's a pretty cheesy instrument. Okay, so what I'm going to do, what do you think, Elling? Is that a good choice?
It's great. Yeah, I love your analogy to salt.
I love salt, but you can't overdo it.
You really can, but you can't go back. Well, I mean, with music mixing, you can, but
with mixing, you could, yeah, of course, you could go back and turn some things down in the previous part of the session, but yeah, I think it's a good way to keep things in mind.
Yeah, and you're right. Guitar Hero 310 explains his username.
Yes.
It was from an episode of The Simpsons. Came out before Guitar Hero was even a thing. He says.
I love it. Video games and Simpsons all in one reference. Like that's username winning in my books.
Yeah, totally. Hoja Plays is mentioning has a question here. Any tips for keeping your ears fresh when mixing?
Absolutely. It's a good question. And there's two things that you should do. Today, for the sake of the stream, obviously I'm mixing on headphones. I wouldn't recommend it. If you're in a situation like Guitar Hero with sleeping babies in the house, obviously it's a necessity at some point. But before you sign off on the mix, you do want to listen to on a decent set of speakers. And even just getting your ears physically uncovered and listening more to what's in your room is going to help immensely. The other thing that's really important, I think, in any creative work, and Elling, I don't know if this is a part of your process, but for me, it's like you have to get up and walk away. You can't sit down and like completely edit, completely mix, and completely master a song in one sitting. If you do, it might turn out okay, but it won't be your best work. I guarantee you. If you walk away, have a cup of coffee, and then come back again, you'll notice something immediately. Maybe it's just that when you came and you sit down, maybe your chair's a little bit further back, or maybe you're a little bit further forward, or something will shift. The other thing that I was given recently.
Sorry. I know I have that feeling, but then sometimes I lose my nerve or something. It sounds so different that I'm like, oh my God, did I spend all that time, failing?
Yeah. But I think a little bit more time allows for that to happen too, that you can go down the rabbit hole of like, oh my God, I've ruined my mix, only to maybe get up the next morning and be like, you know what? No, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Totally.
Yeah. And don't be like, don't put the expectation on yourself right away that every decision that you're making in chronological order is making the mix perfect. Like, you have to kind of rough it in and then level it and then go back and do some more EQ and then go back and do some more effects and then go back and add some automation and then go back to your mix buses. Like, you're not working from left to right in your session. You are constantly working on the whole thing. So that would be my advice for ear fatigue. The other thing that I heard recently that was such a good, simple piece of advice that, again, only recently I've started to work into my workflow is that depending on the genre, but pretty much across the board, if you mix with the physical volume of your speakers really high, you can give yourself a false notion of how well your song is mixed. If everything is big and loud and impressive, it just kind of sounds loud. So another really interesting tip that I've only recently discovered and kind of worked it in myself is actually to like bring up iTunes or however you listen to mastered commercial music, play it on the same computer that you're working on, and turn it down so it's actually a little bit quiet. Turn it down so that you're like, if I was sitting here having a conversation with someone next to me, I wouldn't need to speak any louder than I'm speaking now. It shouldn't be like, oh, what did you say? Turn it down. Like it should be at a conversational level. And then when you're kind of sure of that space, what you'll realize is that as you turn the music up later, it sounds good no matter how far up you turn it. If you mix too loud, what you'll notice, and you might notice this already with some songs that are on the radio or some CDs you have, is that a track will come up and it's just too quiet. And you'll reach over for your volume knob on your car radio and you'll turn it up and you'll enjoy the rest of the song. And then a radio commercial will come along and punch you in the face. And we're going to get a little bit to how to regularize that just before we finish up here. And I know we were supposed to aim for the 45-minute mark, but I think we're going to go a little over. But that is definitely a big tip that I received. Speaking of which, I think we should move on kind of to our mixing segment. And mostly what I want to focus on it, but is not so much on the individual instruments, but it's on the actual track itself. Because something that you can do after you get in and you've gotten creative with your effects and with your EQ is you want to make sure that your track laid up against anybody else's sounds more or less at the right volume. And I say the right volume and not the same volume because if you have a classical piece of music, you can't expect it to be the same volume as a Metallica song. So I'm going to quickly show you what my mastering chain looks like. So mastering is a word that, again, eluded me when I first started. It sounded like someone was doing some form of black magic somewhere. And that I didn't think that I was ever going to be able to master. I would still not call myself a mastering engineer. I would not charge highly professional folks a lot of money to master their tracks. But I do a little bit of mastering on every project that I do to make sure that when I put it out into the world, especially nowadays where we're all on, Twitch, SoundCloud, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, wherever we end up, all of these platforms have regulations for how they kind of flatten the curve across all the tracks and make just do exactly what I was just describing, making sure that if I listen to one of Elling's fantastical electronic songs and then my folk song comes on, you don't have to turn the volume up or down in between our two tracks. So we're going to start by looking at two different things. So let me just walk you through it. The signal flow of this mastering chain goes from left to right on your screen, where I have just a simple gain pot. This gain pot is just a handy way of turning everything down or everything up. The sound leaves the gain and goes into a limiter. Some people call these brick wall limiters because this is an infinite to one ratio compressor kind of thing. So what happens is that you set a threshold, you set an output level, and it just sits there. And if you have a big screeching guitar solo, or if you get a little carried away while you're pushing faders in your mix and everything rises up to the point where it's going to start to clip and get distorted and sound kind of gross, this is just going to duck that down. It'll be pretty subtle unless you're really hitting it hard. But it's a good safety net. So what I tend to do is I just set it really, really light. I set it somewhere between -3 and -6 to make sure that none of my peaks go up beyond that. Then the next thing that's going to happen is it comes into a multi-band compressor. So a multi-band compressor is one of my favorite tools. It's not, I wouldn't say necessarily a straightforward tool, but it is something that's really interesting to play with. And I'll do a little example of what it does when we go back and listen to some of this in a second. But it gives you this one is a 4-band multi-band EQ, but it gives you 4 places in the frequency spectrum that instead of carving it out permanently like you would with an equalizer, you can set a threshold. And the way all compression works is that there's a threshold. And as your sound rises up and meets that threshold and surpasses that threshold, all of your settings on your compressor deal with how the compressor is going to turn that back down to keep it under your threshold. So when you think about it, multi-band means that you're going to have kind of a low mid, a high mid, and a high. And what's really great about that is that instead of having to take all of the low end out of your mix, you can just set this little safety net threshold. And as your drums build up and build up and build up, it can still be really dynamic, but you're going to have this safety net of just, okay, if the low end gets too high, I'm going to just squish it down a little bit. I'm just going to squish it down a little bit. And you do that for each area of the spectrum. The other reason, and it's so simple, but the other reason that I use this, even if it's not engaged, like even you'll see that it kind of dances if it is compressing. Even if I'm doing a classical piece of music and it's not compressing whatsoever, one of the really great features about multiband plugins, and this one is a Waves plugin, but the stock one in Logic and the stock one in any DAW will have this ability, is that you can solo the frequency spectrum. So you can just listen to the low end part of that multiband, and then you can just listen to the low mid part of the multiband, and then you can kind of listen to the highs and listen to the really highs. And even if you don't end up doing anything about it right here in the multiband compressor, it is so, it gives you so much information that you can then go back and start maybe EQing elsewhere or maybe changing volumes of things. So we'll look at that in a second. Then after the multiband compressor, it leaves and there's another gain pot. I don't often use this one, but it does give me just another knob to turn everything up and everything down again. And that goes into a multimeter. So the multimeter doesn't have any sound or effect parameters within it. It doesn't change your sound. It just shows you what's happening. So what I think I'll do now is I'll just dive back in. We'll listen to 30 seconds of this. I'll adjust some parameters to make sure that everything is more or less in a decent place. And then we'll look at the mastering chain and see what's happening. Just bear with me and I will get set up for that. All right. So hopefully you got an idea there what was kind of going on with that multiband compressor that I was kind of showing you. Oh, it looks like I'm just a little bit laggy here. Let me make sure that that's all good. Are you hearing me okay, Elling?
Yeah, I'm hearing you fine. What's the name of that Waves plugin, the multiband?
So that's called the C4 compressor. It has 4 bands. There's also a C6 that has 2 extra bands, but that is, yeah, it's a C4 multiband compressor by Waves.
Cool.
So again, yeah, as I soloed the low end, you probably, depending on what kind of computer speakers you have, or if you're on headphones, you just heard like whoop, 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 whoop. It was just the really low end of the drum. Then that low mid kind of sounded almost like an AM radio station, that it was just kind of nasally and harsh. The high mid even more so. And then the highest band, which is up above 8 kilohertz, that's like up where dogs hear. You know, you're only going to get crashes of cymbals or sibilants off of a vocal. That's pretty much all that's going to be up there. So again, we didn't really get into all of the carving of all the individual channels, so the whole session is sounding really flat right now. But for the sake of example, and I'm just actually going to continue to play this, but you won't hear anything because I'm going to talk about the metering here. before we clue up, because I think this is going to help with you sharing your projects at the end of the RPM. So you can see here that lots of things are dancing around, but the one that I want to bring your attention to the most is this guy. I'll just make the plugin a little bit bigger, and by that I mean really big. So what you're looking for on your mastering output before you go to press is this unit of scale right here. It's LUFS, which stands for loudness units full scale. And one of the things that can be really helpful for you when you're making sure that your mix translates from your studio or your computer or your headphones or your phone or your iPad, wherever you're listening to it, to SoundCloud, and when your friends throw it on their home stereo, they say, yeah, it sounds really great, is that your loudness units full scale are at industry standards. So right now I'm averaging, let me bring this down just a little bit smaller. And again, every meter in each workstation might look a little bit different. Excuse me. But the target is still going to be the same. So I'm averaging minus 17 loudness units full scale. And then on my output, I'm peaking at minus 2, probably because that limiter was helping me out a little bit. And I'm averaging minus 16. So the reading that I've done throughout the pandemic has suggested that most platforms, pretty much across the board, use minus 14 decibels loudness units full scale as their average preference. So if your song comes in and it's averaging minus 14 or less, so in this case I'm at minus 17, SoundCloud, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook won't compress your audio. They won't turn your audio down. You'll kind of slip right through. It's like having the easy pass at a pay toll. You'll just keep going on through. And then what that helps you do at the very least in terms of overall volume is it'll keep your dynamics preserved. So if you've worked really hard on this mix, the last thing you want is everyone taking the loudest part of your track and bringing it down closer to the quietest part of your track. So it's just a really interesting kind of new standard that has kind of more or less only been worked out recently. Because of course, before Apple Music or Spotify, everyone was getting the mastered music via compact disc or cassettes or records, and this is all conversations that only audio engineers had to have with their record labels of how loud is this record going to be, and there were units of measuring that as well. But as everything kind of worked into the prosumer market, this ended up becoming a little bit of a interesting topic, and it changed. Earlier this year, SoundCloud was minus 12 loudness full scale, and then Instagram was minus 18, and everyone was kind of all over the place. But now, after going down a bunch of forums and YouTube rabbit holes, minus 14 is more or less considered to be industry standard. Now, if you're like, oh my God, I don't know how to fix that, it's easy. That is why I left this little volume plug right before the meter. So if everything here is working the way you want it, you're not squishing your mix with compressors, it's not sounding overly compressed, you can come in here and just play the track, and you're not going to hear it right now because I've got my microphone turned on instead. And you can see it's also something you have to kind of listen to the entire track in order for the meter to know what your actual average is. So I've only played about 15 seconds now, but this whole song is more or less at the same level. It's not an overly dynamic track. So if we're averaging minus 17, I can go in here and I can start by creeping up like 1.5, maybe getting closer to 3 in theory. I'm at plus 4 now. And there you go. I'm hitting minus 14 as an average. It's coming and going. And then my peaks are still around minus 2. So for lack of a better term, that track is now ready for radio, apart from the fact that we didn't do a million of the other things that I wanted to do. But it's been an hour and I've done a lot of talking. So I just want to check in with Elling and see how we're doing.
Yo, that's really great. I love the Luff's description and your solution to that. that problem. It probably took you a long time to figure that out.
A lot of YouTube watching, that's for sure.
And one there aren't any new questions in the chat, but there's one great comment, one great suggestion from Chris Sharling on YouTube. He says save multiple copies of your mixing sessions.
Yeah. Again, depending on your DAW, there's lots of different ways you could do this. You could just hit save as and actually label it like version 2. One of the things that you want to watch out for if you have a lot of instruments is that some workstations will then make a copy of all of the files in your session and put it in a new folder, which can start to eat up hard drive space. It can eat up a lot of time, because actually hitting Command S or Command Shift S and doing a save as, you'll see it that's like bundling your workspace, copying audio file, like, it can go on forever. Something that's really great about Logic, for anyone out there who's on Logic, is that the way they call it is actually alternatives. So I can make a new alternative, and it's not going to change the session structure. It's not going to change where the files are hidden on my computer. I can just say Newfoundland folk session number 1. Thanks, Chris. And in this iteration, and when you go to hit save, it's going to ask you, okay, so you're about to make a new iteration, but do you want to save everything you've done in the old iteration up to this point, or have you just started creating this new iteration? The way that I would try to do it is if I'm about to head down a different rabbit path, I would save first. So we'll save Newfoundland folk session. And now we're in a session or an alternative session called Newfoundland folk session, thanks, Chris. And maybe Chris really likes reverb, so we're going to add a bunch of reverb onto everything and see if we like it. Then we get down the end of that rabbit hole, we walk away from the computer for a few minutes, we have a cup of coffee, and we come back and we say, oh my God, it's way too much reverb. You can go back, and under your project alternatives, you'll see that I have Newfoundland folk session and Newfoundland folk session, thanks, Chris. So when I come back, it'll just do a quick reload, but now I'm back to where I was a second ago in terms of where the mix is sitting. So yeah, thanks, Chris. That's it. That is a really good, it's a really good tip. And also if you're mixing for others, I don't know how many are on the stream are just going to be mixing for themselves versus how many people are going, maybe you're just an engineer like I am primarily, and people are going to send you their RPMs and say, hey, can you make this sound better for me? It's really, really helpful tool when you're working with a client, because what I like to do when I'm working with somebody else on their music that I have really, I'm not going to say no artistic stake, because if you're the engineer, you definitely have a very tangible artistic stake in the mix, but I'm not a co-writer. I'm not playing on the record. So you need to establish some sort of commonality. So something that I'll do a lot of the time is just start a Spotify playlist with that artist. And I'll just be like, you don't necessarily have to put songs in here that you want me to try to replicate the production value of, but throw in things that you like, things that you dig. And as you throw it in there, if depending on what platform you're using, if there's an option to add a note next to it, like that's even better. If you use Dropbox or something, you can comment on songs, and like even as the time is going along at 3:55, if there's a cool synth lick, you can have a comment just come up and be like, what I actually like, the whole reason of adding this song to this playlist is I really like that synth lick. And the more information that you get like that out of your artist, then the more quickly you're going to be able to respond to their requests. So if that synth lick was all covered in delay and it was moving around in the spectrum and it was moving around in your headphones and kind of ping-ponging back and forth from left to right, you can say like, oh, okay, so let's go back to this element of your song and maybe we'll try a stereo delay because you seem to like the effect that has. So as you go down those rabbit holes, doing this save alternative is a great way of being able to do A/B comparisons and saying like, okay, this is what happens if we make the synth super full of delay, super full of reverb, all this kind of stuff. And then without having to go back and remember what parameters you set or where different thresholds or different sends were located, you can just go back to your other alternate project session and be like, okay, well, this is what it was like dry. So that is actually a really, really great suggestion, Chris. The other thing that's interesting about that too, the tip that I had earlier about turning your speakers down and kind of actually mixing quietly, is the other thing that you want to make sure that you do is that you don't get too carried away. Again, this is a little bit genre specific. If you're doing like acid rock and it's all about how the keyboard slowly travels from your right ear to your left ear, like you're not going to have great coherence. That's just the nature of it. But coherence is something else that is on that plugin that I showed you. And in Logic, that plugin's just called Multimeter. But it's the, you can see here there's a little correlation meter dancing around, and you also have your gyroscope here, which will show you all of your different phase alignments between your left and your right channel. And with barring certain very specific instances, you do kind of want to make sure that your mix works in mono. It's another trick that I've learned, again, from experienced recording engineers. Of course, a lot of the best records of all time, if you've got friends, family who are into classic rock, a lot of those were actually mixed in mono. And again, it's another great instance of having this stereo gain plugin on the output bus, is that I can actually just come in here and turn mono on, and that plugin is just going to take everything right at the last second and put it all straight up the middle. So the same information is coming out of the left speaker in my studio, the right speaker in my studio, both headphones, all that kind of stuff. And there's two reasons that I suggest that you do this. One is from my background in live sound. If you have too much going on differently from two different speakers in any room, frequencies actually start to cancel each other out, and your mix can actually surprise you as you go into different rooms and hear how different it sounds. And a really wide, incoherent image on your master bus can actually negatively affect your track in any situation that isn't listening under headphones, because of course headphones is like directly addressing your left ear and directly addressing your right ear. So have a quick listen in mono, and of course all of your effects won't sound as cool, but what you're really listening for is just making sure that the song holds up. Can you still hear the words? Can you still hear a little bit of every instrument? Can you still like really detailedly kind of pick out each instrument in the mix? And if you can, if it just loses a bit of a cool factor and then you turn stereo back on, you're probably in a good place. So that's another neat little trick that I learned recently, just to kind of check the coherence of your mix. And you can do that without having to use the multimeter. If you throw the multimeter back on and I just play a little bit of this, you'll see that there's not a whole lot going on. It's just a little line dancing. If this was a big snowball that was all over this spectrum, then that would indicate that there's a lot more stereo image. But the correlation is so good that the little meter has actually gone off the charts. So we're not in trouble on this particular song. So that's another good before you hit print kind of check for yourself. And then the last thing I would say before you really kind of hit send on your process is something that people refer to as the carrot test, which I'm sure some of you have heard that term before. I was first introduced to it in the movie Once. It eventually became a musical, but they kind of stay in the studio all night and they're recording for like 72 hours straight, and then they get up, the sun's just rising, they throw the cassette into the car stereo and they drive up the coast. And that's kind of like their final approval, is that they've taken themselves out of the studio space, out of that very technical kind of dry environment, and they've put themselves where music is heard. So in a car, down at your kitchen table through a Bluetooth speaker. A lot of the live streaming stuff I do, not necessarily for live, but if something is pre-recorded and the medium that's going to be delivered to is YouTube, I'll just check it on my iPad, because for a lot of people, if they're scrolling through Facebook and they want to tune into your feed, that is the medium that they're going to receive it in. They're not everyone, maybe Elling and me, but not everyone's going to take their iPad over and plug it into a hi-fi set of speakers and then stand 6 feet back from the speakers and make sure their head is perfectly in the center. They're just going to turn on their iPad and say, hey,
I do that every tab. I do that every stream that I listen
to. I
know.
I have like a measuring stick from each ear to make sure. But it is an important reminder that iPhones, iPads, tablets of any kind, built-in computer speakers, like your song has to work in all these environments. So it's good to check them before you share, because depending on your headphones, it could sound amazing. But
The worst earbuds you could buy. Just preview it on those, because someone's going to listen to it on there.
And again, bringing all this back into the context of the RPM, like you might not have all of this at your disposal in terms of right at your fingertips in the studio working environment. But if you have these techniques in your mind, you could make do with the stuff that's around your house. Honestly, like I said, a Bluetooth speaker. I have one that's down in my kitchen for when I'm cooking. It was like $150. It's not the best one. It's not a fantastic sound bar with a subwoofer or anything. It's just like something that conceivably some of my viewers might be listening to my product on, right? So it's a really good opportunity. And if you're doing something more labor intensive, like you're actually creating an album, you're actually trying to get the music out in a commercial format, then it's definitely something you're going to want to check on multiple systems and multiple spaces. And you'll go through a much more thorough mastering process than what I just showed you here in 5 minutes. But yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind.
This is a late question because it's just coming in, but I'm completely new to RPM, and from Melanie Knight on YouTube. I'm completely new to RPM and even recording at home, but is it possible to actually optimize a song for all platforms?
It's a good question, and part of me wants to say yes, but I guess the thing that you do have to prepare yourself for is that, I've been doing this maybe not every day, but every week for a year. And I still run into this issue. I uploaded a video last night of a summer performance to Facebook. Facebook didn't want to process the video in HD. And of course, it's not just the video that gets compromised when Facebook compresses your file. It also lowers the bit rate on the audio. So it sounds a little filtery. It sounds warbly. And you're like, man, that's not what I worked 15 hours on. So without discouraging you, the answer is kind of yes and no. If you go through a mastering plugin, some of those are available out there. Waves has a really interesting one that I can maybe throw a link on the feed after we clue up. But there are a couple of really, really interesting, almost AI-esque mastering plugins now where you can take a song that is of a similar genre to yours, load it right into the plugin. Like you actually load it into the plugin, not into your session. And you play 30 seconds of it, or you play the chorus of it, and the plugin does frequency analysis. It does loudness analysis. It does dynamics. It does all of these things. And it kind of creates a sketch of what that song, quote unquote, sounds like. And then you unplug that particular song and you just hit play on your session, and the plugin does an immediate A/B comparison. And the ones that I've seen, and I haven't actually used them yet because I've kind of just used that as inspiration, and kind of I do it a little more offline analog myself, but it doesn't automatically change everything. All that plugin's going to do is it's going to show you in meters and on a spectrograph. It's going to show you like, okay, the song that you're using for inspiration has a bit more low-end information than your mix does. The song that you're using for information, the difference between the verse and the chorus in terms of dynamics is much greater. Your mix is kind of all at the same volume. And it will kind of paint you this visual picture that you can then go back and use some of the tools that we talked about earlier in the stream, EQ, compression, dynamics, automation, and try to carve your song to be more like that song, which I actually think is a pretty cool tool. Like, I don't know that the highest end engineers at Capitol Records are using that particular plugin, but for someone who is just trying to wrap their head around the world of mastering, it's kind of a cool example leader, you know?
Amazing. Brian, this has been amazing.
Oh man, I feel like I just skimmed across the top of each topic. As you know, we could talk for hours here, but hopefully there was little tidbits that were useful for everyone.
Totally. I've been mixing my own stuff for years, and I got to glean a lot of stuff from you. Thank you. I hope people out there got some good things out of it. Take what you learned now and just go out and make make some sounds. Don't get intimidated though. It doesn't have
That's
to be
the
perfect.
biggest. Yeah, that's definitely the biggest thing. It's you know, I go down the rabbit hole, and again, what I'll do is I'll pop onto the Facebook page of both RPM and NL Folk Society after we've done here, and I'll post a couple of YouTube channels that I find really helpful. People that just are like really great at boiling it down to the kind of the bare minimum, giving you the information and then letting you decide what you want to do with it, as opposed to some you know, some more preachy blogs that say you have to use this plugin or you have to hit this level on your meter scale. And I just very much subscribe to the fact that there is no one cookie cutter template that will work for every song of every genre. Obviously, music is just way too diverse. But there are definitely universal themes and universal tools that you could use. But you're absolutely right. You can start by just piano and key and vocal, and one's louder than the other, and you can hit print and it's still a song. That's the point, is it is still a song. And you know, the more you go deeper into it, sure, you can make things better, but in a lot of situations, especially for RPM where it's about sharing ideas, right? Like a lot of it just comes down to let's get this out to the world, let's share what we're creating, right?
Totally. Well, thank you very much, Brian. Anything you want to say before we sign off?
No, I just thanks for the NL Folk Art Society for having me, and go ahead and like or comment on the video. If you have any questions, you can pop them right there in the chat or on the video itself, and I can continue to answer back as time goes by, as the month goes on. But yeah, that's basically it. Go out, have fun, get creative. Don't be afraid to ask questions if you're trying to figure something out.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you, everybody.
Happy recording.